This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. It's no secret this country is facing an opioid crisis, and North Carolina witnessed the second highest increase in opioid deaths in the country just last year. Later in the program, we hear from a U.S. State Department official playing the leading role in the international aspects of this crisis. But first, another crisis. Charlotte's Arts and Science Council was, at one time, among the most successful arts fund drives in the nation. But ever since the recession, it has fallen on hard times. They have seen a sharp fall off in giving, and they say they're facing a crisis point. Recently, they proposed that Mecklenburg County levy a quarter-cent sales tax, with some of the money being used to make up for the loss of revenue from the donor community. That is bound to be a difficult sell, but we're going to hear more about the need and this proposed solution. Alicia McDowell is the incoming board chair of the Arts and Science Council. She is in our Spirit Square studio along with Stacy Anderson, the co-chair of the ASC's Designated Revenue Study Committee. Welcome to you both. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you. If you'd like to join our conversation, you can email us at charlottetalks@wfae.org. Search for WFAE on Facebook. Get to us through Twitter at Charlotte Talks. You can even watch us right now, even as we speak, on Facebook Live. So let's start at the beginning. A very good place to start. What happened? We used to brag about the Arts and Science Council being primo in terms of fundraising in the country. What changed?
Workplace giving changed. So philanthropic, there were just many changes in the philanthropic approach. In the United States, it's not specific to Charlotte, but we were so heavily reliant on workplace giving that as that model started to fall off nationally and locally, we saw significant drop.
And that model didn't work everywhere.
It never worked everywhere.
So
right?
why did it work here when it worked here?
So it worked here because Charlotte was a place
stay and live. So they would come to Charlotte, they would be here for decades. They would go and work in their company, and they would work in that company for decades. And so they were heavily invested in this community, and having these two pillars, really United Way and ASC, having those two pillars being the recipients of workplace giving, people felt really good about giving to the community. Now we have people who move constantly. They come in and out of Charlotte. They come from other communities, most of which fund arts and culture through government.
Right.
So there's a municipal office of arts and culture, and they're not accustomed to the funding model that we've relied on here for decades. So we're in flux.
So, Stacy, in addition to being the co-chair of the ASC's Designated Revenue Study Committee, you also work with one of the banks. Can I say which one?
Sure.
Okay, Wells Fargo. And Wells Fargo's been around in this city for a while. Before that, it was Wachovia. Before that, it was First Union. It's a place where, if it's like every other corporate entity in this town used to be, highly motivated. Let's put it nicely, they highly motivated their employees to give, both to the United Way and to the Arts and Science Council. If donor giving at that level, at the corporate level, through payroll deduction, has fallen off, is that because the corporations aren't locally based and don't have skin in the game and aren't pushing employees to give to the levels they used to?
So I can only use my example of 24
Okay.
years at Wells Fargo and legacy companies. So when I joined, there was a lot of push from leadership to get everybody who joined the company to be active participants and donating to the company.
Mm-hmm.
The focus on financial donations has waned, but at Wells Fargo, community service, community support is still one of our pillars and one of our goals. So we're encouraging people to do it however they want to, and it's not necessarily organized against those two things, United Way and ASC. So the concept of philanthropic giving at Wells Fargo hasn't changed over 24 years. It's just how you do it. Whether it's no longer a financial gift to those two organizations, it's however the team member wants to do it.
And in fairness, I think that is a very common change that we're seeing across these large global institutions that are located here. So a lot of institutions that used to have these combined fundraising activities, workplace giving campaigns, don't have them at all. So Bank of America is another good example.
How many arts groups are there in Charlotte?
Well, there are
Not just the ones you support.
Well, that's a completely different question. There are more than 30 that are operating partners.
With you?
With ASC specifically. There are emerging groups. There are startup groups. So I can't give you a top number because that's a sector.
In the hundreds?
No, but certainly I would say more than the 30 that we
So
support.
the original point of the arts and science, and this predates my arrival here, which was in I think 1862. The original point was, as the arts community was growing, it was becoming difficult for corporations and to be hit up for money by all these different arts groups, because it wasn't them just being hit up for money. They wanted to have this participation at the employee level. And when you have the opera and the symphony and Charlotte Repertory Theater and Actors Theater and Charlotte, and all these different groups coming to all these different businesses, it became oppressive. So they started a united way for the arts, which
Correct.
is the Arts and Science Council. That's not attractive anymore?
Well, they certainly don't want to have everybody coming to them. Neither does the government want to have everybody coming to them for these individual gifts. It's still attractive to them, but the issue is that the workplace giving component is not, it's just not consistent with their corporate philosophy about philanthropy. As we just heard Stacy describe about Wells Fargo, it's not a lack of commitment to philanthropy, but it is a recognition that our model is sort of a unicorn at this point. On a national basis, and so as a consequence, they're moving away from that. So lots of places that have these campaigns.
So from
don't have them.
2005 to 2008, the ASC received $16 million or more from givers. And that averaged out almost every year, $16 million, somewhere in there. In 2009, it fell to $12 million, and it's been hovering around $10 million, if I understand this correctly, ever since. What was it last year?
Oh, it's right around 10 million, just north of 10 million.
You have to understand, 4.5 of that comes from local government already, so it's only 6 million coming from private sources.
Oh, really? That
So
includes
the mix
the other.
that includes
everything.
That includes everything, right? So, of the 25 largest cities in America, 19 of them are funded solely by government funds. Charlotte is one of the 6 that's a combination of private and public. So it's a little bit different model here in Charlotte.
And you've said that because we've gotten to this $10 million figure, $6 million from donors, that you are in a crisis point. You're at a crisis point.
The sector is,
What
yes.
does that mean?
That means that we're going to start seeing institutions fail. We're going to start seeing the programming that we rely on go away. We're not going to be able to support emerging institutions, things like the field trips. I think the last time I was here talking with you, Mike, we talked about these field trips in schools. These field trips are no longer being funded. They were being funded initially by CMS, and then when CMS stopped funding our kids to go to Discovery Place or to go to a play or to go to Imagine On, we stepped into the breach and started to fund that. We don't have the funds to fund that. It's those sorts of things that I think as a community we believe are important. We've heard from the community what they want. They've been loud and clear.
This fall off seems to coincide with the recession. Did it?
It did.
Did it
right?
just break people's habits? Is
Well,
that what happened? The
I
habit
think
got
it-
broken?
I think it broke their pocketbooks, right? They could no longer
Certainly
give. They
at
had
that
to go
time,
back
yeah,
to the necessities, right?
But it also broke their habits.
Okay, because I'm going to say we've recovered from that a long time ago.
The arts and culture sector hasn't, though, I would argue, because they haven't gotten the revenue streams back in. People pay for programming, so some of the smaller groups, like the Black Box Theater, which used to be here, is no longer here, right? It's an example of a small organization that couldn't survive because their donations and their funding didn't come up.
Right.
People fund for programs, but they don't do operational expenses like a development department in a small organization, right?
It should be pointed out that even though tickets to things are monstrously expensive in some cases, the ticket prices do not fund the cost of the productions. Why?
Virtually never, because the tickets, it's generally the model of fundraising for the cultural sector here and across the country. It's earned revenue plus donated revenue, and we've seen an uptick in donations to the individual organizations themselves, but the sector itself is not getting the funds.
I mean, the arts here are so much more than just Broadway musicals, but Broadway is a profit-making venture, and they either make a profit or the show closes. So why can't that be the model?
Well, that's where you find the highest ticket prices, right? So what we're trying to do is get arts and culture for every person in Mecklenburg County, regardless of whether you earn $1 million or you earn $100 or you earn $50,000, right? And just by bringing in those big Broadway shows, that's not accomplishing that mission. So you've got to have some lower cost performances and whatever to get everybody access to culture in Mecklenburg County.
And to have a healthy ecosystem, it's not going to just be Broadway shows. We're going to have museums. We're going to have performing arts. We're going to have visual arts. That's what it takes to have a healthy cultural sector and to be able to attract to our community businesses that want to be someplace that have a healthy cultural sector, millennials and other individuals who want to come to a community that's rich, right? We want to have that richness for our community. We had 3 million customer
If they want it,
experiences.
why don't they support it?
But they do, right? We had 3. This is what I was getting ready to say.
They're not giving to you anymore.
They are giving to these individual organizations. The giving that is down is workplace giving. We are seeing increases in other giving, but it's not making up the difference in the workplace giving. So what I was going to say in terms of audience is that we've had 3 million customer experiences in the sector on an annual basis in this community. There's a huge audience, right? If you think about sports, that's the 500,000 more people going to cultural experiences in this community than we have going to sports experiences in this community.
Okay. So why aren't they, if people want to go and they're supporting individual efforts by buying tickets and maybe even making donations to individual organizations, everybody has a job where they couldn't do that.
Right.
So why is workplace giving down? Why don't they just, why isn't payroll deduction an easy, painless, invisible way to participate in the things that you like?
It is, but millennials don't want to give that way. They'd
Well,
rather give to their favorite cause, and a specific, if Tommy needs tennis shoes, I'm
So
going to buy
does that
tennis
mean
shoes.
then that the Arts and Science Council's time has come and gone?
You still need some sort of organization to manage public art within Mecklenburg
Why?
County. How else is it going to happen?
Every community that we consider to be a peer community has a rich cultural life. They do it through government frequently, but it exists. This is not a question of why, it's how are we going to do this? How are we going to accomplish this? Or we're going to fall behind these other communities that we consider to be peers. And you know, I do a lot of work at with the former Charlotte Chamber, now the Business Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
We can't have a community that has a sector that is failing in this way.
So by your own admission, Stacy, in a report by the Designated Revenue Study Committee, as donor attitudes began to shift away from giving to an umbrella organization like the Arts and Science Council towards giving directly to organizations, you say those, this is a quote, cultural organizations that relied on the United Arts model for support did not build strong internal fundraising programs or foster deep relationships with individual donors, both of which are critical components of successful philanthropic programs and the hallmark of philanthropic support for arts and culture nationally. Essentially, these groups that the Arts and Science Council has traditionally supported had no reason to build fundraising organizations of their own, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, their participation in the ASC limited what fundraising they could do on their own. Is that right?
No, they're not limited in their fundraising. And in fact, we provide professional development and support to these organizations to help them fundraise.
Did they not do a
something we
good job
see.
of that because they were relying too heavily on you?
Over time, that has shifted, right? So we saw this train coming down the tracks. You know, we did a task force on this in 2014. What you see is the large organizations have built out very successful fundraising capacity and fundraising capabilities. But that leaves all of the sort of mid-sized organizations, the organizations that are smaller or emerging, the ones that are giving art or offering art in neighborhoods. Those organizations are foundering because they don't have the same sort of development support.
So if millennials don't want to give to an umbrella organization, they want to give to individual arts organizations that they like, that they want to support themselves, what are they, I may have to hold this question, the answer to this question in abeyance until after the break, but what are they giving to? What are you noticing they are giving to as opposed to you? And then when we come back, we'll also talk about this proposal for a 1/4-cent sales tax to support the arts in Charlotte. We'll do that in just a moment. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Greer Walker, a regional CPA and business advisory firm committed to leveraging specialized knowledge for the real estate and construction industries. Details at GreerWalker.com. And NC by Train, helping transport ACC fans to Charlotte for the ACC tournament. Schedules, tickets, and more available at ncbytrain.org. ICE agents arrested about 200 people in the state last month in a series of raids, many in Charlotte. Some of those arrested either had criminal convictions or charges pending. But about 50 immigrants were picked up, even though immigration enforcement was not specifically looking for them. ICE says all of this is the result of Mecklenburg and other counties opting out of the 287G program. So we will hear from ICE and others about all this tomorrow on this program at 9.
It's illegal to fire people based on many personal attributes. But what about firing someone because of their hairstyle? New York City is considering banning that. It's been a problem for many groups, including African Americans. Hair without harassment. Next time on 1A.
1A coming up right after Charlotte Talks from 10 to noon here on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about the Arts and Science Council and the crisis situation they say they are facing as donor giving at the corporate level, and by that I mean employee contributions through payroll deduction have ceased pretty much. The whole profile of the program has changed on the part of corporations and their employees. Felicia McDowell is the incoming board chair for the Arts and Science Council. Stacey Anderson is also with us, co-chair of the ASC's Designated Revenue Study Committee. These kinds of payroll deduction campaigns where you would go to work for a company and the company would have an annual campaign for the United Way or an annual campaign, in this case, for the Arts and Science Council. Those campaigns don't take place anymore.
Correct.
Anywhere?
Correct. Well, no, not anywhere, but the largest campaigns have gone away, completely gone away. So it's not a matter of employees just voting with their feet and not giving the money. There's no campaign at a lot of these large
So
institutions.
if you go back historically in Charlotte, you had the banks and you had Duke, right? You had the big companies, and that was mandatory in those companies. As more and more employers move in, they didn't adopt that model. So, we would talk to, Ingersoll Rand or someone and say, can you do a campaign? And they're like, no, that's not our model, right?
Okay.
So, the big banks now can't really compete if they force that model and nobody else does, right? I mean, why would you work for a company that does that when I can go work here? And
if millennials are giving, and it's not probably just millennials, I'm sure everybody if they are interested in the opera, they'll give to Opera Carolina. If millennials are giving to certain organizations, are you seeing a trend? Can you discern from what they're giving to what they want more of?
Sure. So what they're giving to, it actually is completely consistent with what we've heard from the community that the community wants in the sector at large, right? They're giving it programming that supports kids, pre-K to 12 education programming. So those specific things, they're giving it relevant, interesting, cool, new exhibits that come into town or programs that fit into that category. And they're also supporting programming that's art where you live. So we're seeing a lot of program around that.
So as you said, if things continue the way they are going right now and have been going since 2008 or 9, you're not going to be able to fund a lot of these organizations that you have traditionally funded, and they will drop by the wayside. And I think the linchpin in all of this is probably the symphony. Even if you never go to a symphony concert, the presence of a symphony here makes possible the Broadway series, because that's where the musicians come from in the pit, among other things.
Correct.
So you are proposing, and you went to the Board of County Commissioners for a 1/4-cent sales tax to help support the arts. Where did that idea emerge and when?
So we actually are asking for 1/10 of a penny.
I got
right?
it. We'll explain why it's a 1/4
We'll
cent.
go through that.
Yeah.
So the sales tax actually came from the study committee that Stacey worked on. She can talk about it, where they looked at a number of different options for ways to get to a dedicated revenue stream for the arts.
Right. So the study committee was proposed of not only community leaders, but cultural partners, as well as staff support from the city and county. And so we started our work in the summer. We looked at several different options. We had people in from Denver, Cleveland, San Francisco, American for the Arts. We looked at all the different models. We had panels of cultural partners, the large ones, the symphony, smaller ones like Light Factory. And we got a lot of input and we looked at that. So that was really our first kind of education session. And then the next time we met, we looked at all the options. So we looked at property tax. We looked at the hotel motel tax. We looked at like cigarette tax like Cleveland does, which is not going to be sustainable. And then we looked at sales tax. And we worked through a process, and that one seemed the most reliable. The county has already been authorized to do that by the legislature, right?
They've been authorized to levy their own quarter-cent sales tax
That's
for their own specified purposes.
That's correct.
Okay.
Right. The hotel prepared food tax, a lot of that is going towards facilities. It's also about putting heads in beds, and we're not about bringing more people in to come see Hamilton. We want to give arts to the Mecklenburg County residents, all of them, right, where they live.
So this quarter-cent sales tax would raise about $50 million in 2021, and the reason it's a quarter cent is because the legislature has authorized counties to raise their sales tax by a quarter cent for their own purposes. They did not authorize municipalities to raise the sales tax by 0.1%. It has to be a 0.25% or nothing.
Absolutely, which means if we are successful and we get on the ballot with this initiative, there will be additional funds. Of that $50 million you're discussing, we had recommended $20 million go to the cultural sector, and that the balance of the funds could be used for other public goods to be determined by the county commission.
How long are you proposing that this sales tax be in place to support the arts? In perpetuity?
So there is no sunset on the sales tax, but the decisions as to how those monies would be used, those would be decisions by the county commission.
So why not take it all? Take it all for the first couple of years and go away.
Well,
Build an endowment. Seriously.
That is certainly something that we could do, but we don't think that that's the right thing to do. Right? This is public money. We're trying to be conservative. We're trying to look at this in the way that will stabilize the health of the sector, but also allow us to deliver these cultural offerings in an equitable way across the community. We can be getting art where you live in all of our county districts. So it won't matter if you're on Eastland Mall or if you're on the west side or if you're in Ballantyne or you're in University. You can be getting the benefit of this in your neighborhood, which is what the community has said that they want.
You're already getting, I think you pointed this out, Stacy, about $4 million from the city and the county.
And the 6 towns, yeah.
Okay, every year. Where's that money coming from?
So that is
General
just
fund?
general fund, right? And so that would go away. We would switch to just
that would go
we
away.
would just go to the sales tax revenue, right? So it's not a net 20 million new. It's, you take that back out. So we also don't think that you could build an endowment, but part of it is having that annual revenue stream that grows as the city grows and the county grows with people coming in and supporting new organizations. I mean, we felt like we don't need the whole $50 million, and would that really pass the acid test if we asked for it, right?
No.
So we tried to come at a number that helps us sustain the large organizations like the Symphony, and then also build new ones, and enough to make the cultural and art community vibrant again. It's not vibrant at the moment.
And when you say it's not vibrant at the moment, what does that mean?
Well, it means you're not seeing new organizations pop up. You're seeing small ones that try to grow, not growing. We talked a little bit about the bigger ones have endowment and made relationships with their customers. Small artists are just worried about the art, right? They're not worried about the administrative and all that stuff. So that's the muscle we have to help them build, right? So if it happens again, they do have those arms and they don't crash like we've seen them crash.
Yeah, but even with the funding challenges, in the region, we have 58,000 creatives in this region, right? 27,000 creatives just in Mecklenburg County. So there's a lot of money in this as well. So we're a key component of the economic picture of the county.
So we're about to go through a property tax revaluation. This was probably not, the timing on this seems
Wouldn't have chosen
not
this
the best.
timing.
So what was the county commission's reaction to your proposal?
I don't think that they would have chosen this timing either. We showed up and made this ask because we needed it, right? This isn't a hypothetical. This isn't a fake emergency. We're coming to the county because we're at a turning point, a pivotal place where we will lose these organizations. And the money, if we're successful, won't come in until 2021. So none of these organizations would see a dime of the sales tax money until 2021. That's why it's so important that we go ahead and get this process rolling.
You had to have known that several years ago, I believe, voters emphatically refused to raise the sales tax by a quarter cent to increase teacher pay. It was, I think, 61 to 39 against, 61% to 39 against. What does that tell you?
Well, so there was another referendum that we did more recently that didn't fail by quite those numbers. What we've seen from Cleveland and some other organizations, it's taken them several tries to get this passed. And each time you put a referendum on the ballot, you learn more and you learn more. We're starting earlier in the process to do this. We've got a better story to tell and a better case to make. Plus, we also have the Urban Institute at UNC Charlotte that does annual surveys for us. And since 2008, I believe, it's like 70% of the people surveyed believe in government funding of arts and culture. So we think the surveys match the demographics of Mecklenburg County. So we think we have a pretty good chance of doing this.
I'm not sure how to ask this question delicately, so I don't think there is a way to ask it delicately. Let's just talk about this. Overhead. What do you bring to the table that we need?
Well, we bring experience in grant making and assessment. We're looking at the entire sector top down. We're not looking at just individual organizations. So we bring that to the table. And also we believe that we will be able to drive down the costs of being able to manage this. So we would expect to have a comparatively low management fee if ASC does this work. But we also said to the county—
What does that mean, comparatively low management? I looked at your financials.
10%.
10%. And that is lower than most charities. And it is, and you're exactly right. It is 10%.
I know.
Your overhead's about $1 million. Although I do question why you need to pay, I think it's $220,000 a year for rent. That's $17,000 a month.
Well, we're moving locations, so the
Good.
rent's going to go down.
Good idea.
Right. But even in this building—
Actually, $18,000.
Yeah, even in this building, we house Studio 345, which is an after-school program that's
part
arts
of your
enrichment.
rent?
That's not part of our rent, but it's part of the rent expense that we will be incurring as we move, right? Because we're losing this space.
You also fund a 401k program for your employees with an employer match of 50 cents for every dollar, up to 3% of employee compensation, which amounted to $58,000 in 2015. I would venture to say that none of the artists you support have a 401k. Why do you?
I don't know that none of the artists have a 401k.
I would say that none of them. Maybe the musicians union. Maybe.
I think that's definitely part of the union negotiation. Why do they have a 401k? Because they're talented employees. I mean, I think most of the people in this room with you have a 401k. We're investing in our people and we're investing in this community. I mean, I'm not apologetic about that. But we are looking closely at our overhead, and we are reducing overhead in light of all the things that are going on. We have a lot of positions that have gone unfilled. That goes to the point that you were making earlier about development. I mean, part of the problem that we're dealing with is everybody cut all of their staff, right? And they cut all of their administration, and that's part of the reason why we don't have the talent now to raise the money privately, right? So we have to invest in our people in order to be able to do this work properly.
But the directors of your organization collectively, the salary costs are in the neighborhood of $850,000 a year.
Well, our costs are our people. That we don't make widgets, right? We go out and we perform services. We serve as a resource hub. We support these individual artists. We support these organizations. We do the grant making that the city or county would otherwise do if the city or county were in the business of having an Office of Cultural Affairs. If these were city or county employees, they would have a 401k. So, I mean, we're standing in the shoes of the county when we're providing these services. They designated us to do this work. I don't think anyone would be asking why a city employee would have a 401k.
What about the dancers at the Charlotte Ballet?
I'm all for the dancers at the Charlotte Ballet having a 401k. It's not going to happen unless we find a way to support the sector.
Ricky asked, is this the quarter-cent sales tax, the same tax that CATS wants to use to expand the transit system? Is this a different quarter cent? Or
It's the only quarter cent that the county's been authorized to spend. So I'm sure there's other people asking for it, but the commissioners will make the decision on whether it goes on the ballot and what they'll support with it.
Given the need for transit, does that give you pause?
Well, $50 million doesn't buy you a lot of transit.
That's true, it doesn't. One rail. Barry emails, workplace giving is not down because of an increasingly transitory workforce or changes in corporate charitable philosophy. Workplace giving is down because corporations no longer pay most employees a living wage. Mm-hmm. The idea of raising taxes on people who can't afford the necessities of life so that people in $1,000 suits and evening gowns can enjoy subsidized ticket prices to the opera and symphony is utterly out of touch with the reality of how most people live.
Let me respond to that. I'm sympathetic to that argument. We spend a lot of time at ASC working closely with the county, deploying these arts resources across community in underserved neighborhoods. If you look at the Culture Block program that has been supported by the county, we're in 9 different neighborhoods. We've had 25,000 people participate in that. These are free activities on the west side and in districts 2, 3, 4, and 6. I'm not talking about people going to the opera in fancy gowns. That's something that happens in our arts sector, but it's not the only thing that happens. I mean, I grew up broke in this community. I was active in the arts. I would never have gotten my scholarship if I hadn't had access to the arts. There are thousands of people like me who want to have that kind of opportunity. So that would be my response.
So where do you go from here?
So we continue to work with the county. We provide answers to any questions they have about our proposal and our response, and they continue to work on if they're going to put it on the referendum or not and what they would partner it with.
That's Stacey Anderson. She's co-chair of the ASC's Designated Revenue Study Commission. Felicia McDowell is the incoming board chair for the Arts and Science Council. Thank you both for joining us this
Thank you,
morning.
Mike.
Thank you.
The opioid... Forgot about the harp. The opioid crisis has reached epidemic proportions in the United States, and as we have discussed in the past, North Carolina is suffering greatly as a result. Last year, the state saw the second highest increase in opioid deaths in the nation, and the government has blamed the prevalence of fentanyl. Combating that drug is an international effort, and for the remainder of the hour, we're going to talk with the federal government's point man in the State Department in this fight. James Walsh is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. He's in town to talk about his work with the World Affairs Council Charlotte at lunch today at noon at the Hilton City Center, and he joins us for the remainder of the hour. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
Put a number on the number of deaths attributed to the rising use of fentanyl, both in the country at large and in North Carolina, and how does it compare to previous drug scourges?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike, and unfortunately the numbers are pretty staggering. If you look at the numbers since 2000, we've had over 300,000 Americans die from opioids and based on overdoses. That is primarily due to fentanyl and also the heroin that's coming from Mexico.
So in the past, when we've talked about the opioid problem on this program, we've talked about how it started, the genesis, as far as I can tell, was through legitimate prescription drugs that were either overprescribed or inaccurately used and used for a longer period of time than generally recommended. That led to addiction problems, and when patients could no longer get the prescribed opioids, they turned to things like heroin, which is cheaper and more readily available. And then heroin began to be, infiltrated by fentanyl? Is that what happened there?
Well, essentially what happened is that the price point, it's so valuable for the cartels, it was just a great opportunity for them to make money. And also because the way the brain works and the way the addict is seeking more heroin, it's a better high for them.
And fentanyl is a legitimately used drug,
It is
correct?
a controlled substance that's legitimately used in hospitals for anesthesiology.
But the fentanyl you're talking about is not necessarily the same fentanyl, and it's certainly not used in the same way.
No, it's not. This is fentanyl coming up in powder form, created and made primarily in China. And it's either shipped directly to the United States or shipped into Mexico where the cartels mix it.
When did fentanyl come into the picture in this opioid problem that we face in this country?
Yeah, it's a good question. It started to see its prevalence maybe about 6-7 years ago. It's been around actually for years. In fact, we're not the first country that had this problem, but we're the first country certainly has such a crisis.
And the problem is not only that people are using fentanyl for purposes it was not originally intended to be used for, and in ways that it wasn't originally intended to be used. The problem is also that fentanyl has many derivatives over which people have no knowledge, no control, and it's coming to them in doses that there's no way to know what you're really getting.
And that's a big problem. It's being mixed either with the heroin. It's being created in a press pill, so the cartels will make it in a pill, and it's not mixed correctly. It's being mixed with cocaine, methamphetamines, you name it, and it's all over. They don't know what they're getting.
James Walsh is the federal government's point man on the international control of this substance and trying to get it under control, and we'll continue to talk about that aspect of this when we come back at Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Atrium Health, serving the Carolinas in specialties like heart, cancer, and pediatric care. Atrium Health, dedicated to promoting better lives through better health. And Willis Towers Watson, dedicated to helping organizations navigate the challenges of a complex and changing world with an integrated approach to risk and human capital management. Willis Towers Watson. Coming up in 20 minutes on 1A, the New York Times reported this week that the targeting of people based on their hair or hairstyle at work, school, or in public spaces will now be considered racial discrimination in New York City. And Joshua Johnson and his guests will talk about these new guidelines and about hair and the workplace in about 20 minutes. That'll be on 1A. We're going to come right back and talk more with about our opioid problem in just a moment.
All Things Considered on WFAE helps you go beneath the surface of the day's news.
And these chronic conditions disproportionately impact Black and Hispanic populations in Mecklenburg County. So the network of 60 churches reaches those communities to educate congregants on healthy eating and exercise.
There's more to every story. Listen weekday afternoons from 4 to 6:30 for All Things Considered from NPR News and 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. James Walsh is our guest for the remainder of the hour, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. I swear I don't know how you government people put all that on your door.
Yeah, try putting on a business card.
That's exactly right. He is here under the auspices of the World Affairs Council Charlotte. As I mentioned a second ago, he'll be speaking at lunch at noon at the Hilton City Center, and there are still seats available for that. You can go to their website or to ours for more information. So deaths from fentanyl and fentanyl-laced drugs are skyrocketing. In this state, the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition distributed over 1,200 test strips to drug users so that they could self-test what they were about to inject to see if it contained fentanyl. 82% of those strips tested positive, and it only takes a tiny amount of fentanyl to wreak havoc. And those amounts, and this is part of the problem, can be and are being shipped through the mail. How much does it take to cause really irrevocable harm?
It doesn't take a lot. If you take your sugar pack and you just take a little bit of grams out of that, that's enough to kill somebody.
Really?
And so the dosage is pretty significant. And the sad thing is there's scarier stuff out there. We recently got control of carfentanil, which is another fentanyl-like substance that's 100 times more powerful than fentanyl.
Is that part of the problem, that as soon as you get something under control, something else comes up that's worse and takes its place?
Yeah, that's a problem. Because these road chemists are everywhere, the creation of the internet, they're sharing these cocktails. They're creating different substances, one a week.
You mentioned Mexico, you mentioned China. We have our own drug cocktail manufacturers here who lurk in the shadows. Why have you identified China as the key player here, the big problem here?
Yeah, well, they have 170,000 chemical plants in China, and so it's a huge industry. And the other reality is that we have such mass economic trade with them and such connections is that it just became the natural producer for these chemicals.
They say that's not true. The senior Chinese official says it is highly irresponsible to draw such a conclusion. And they publicly deny that they're a source of fentanyl. But behind the scenes, they're working with you. If their statements are true, why are they working with you?
Because its statements are not true. So they are working with us, as you mentioned. That's where the State Department plays a major role, and we've been really working behind the scenes.
Why is the State Department involved in this? Why isn't it? Don't we have a Bureau of Narcotics, Alcohol, and Firearms? Why aren't they the point people?
And we have a Department of Justice, and we have a Department of Homeland Security, and we have the White House. So it's not just the State Department, but clearly our embassy in China is the point for negotiations with the Chinese. In addition, there's an international aspect of that, and one of the diplomatic strategies we're working on is that it helps to remind China, if they want to be a recognized global leader, which is what part of their strategy, that they don't want to be a drug state.
Is that why their statements notwithstanding, they're actually eager to work with you because they don't want to be seen to be a rogue
I think
state?
so. And I think also the continued pressure, diplomatic pressure. It's not just coming from us, and that's something that I've been working on. I've been working on getting the Europeans and others to recognize that this synthetic problem is not just a problem in the United States, but it's coming to a theater near them. And
What does that mean, synthetic problem? Now, fentanyl has been described as a synthetic opioid, or there are different synthetic versions of fentanyl that are either opioids or added to opioids. Explain that. What are we talking about?
Yeah, when I say synthetics, it's the broad class of these drugs that are just basically produced out of chemicals. We're so used to dealing with drugs, illicit drugs that are produced out of the flora of the plant, the cocaine, the heroin, which is the poppy, or the marijuana. This can just be produced in somebody's basement. Methamphetamines is another example of synthetics.
So if the Chinese really want to cooperate because they don't want to appear to be a rogue state and actually do want to appear to a recognized global leader, this is a global issue.
This is absolutely a global issue. 31 million people around the world are addicted to drugs.
Do they have a drug problem in China? The president says he likes the president of China's attitude toward people who sell and manufacture illegal drugs, the death penalty. Do they use the death penalty? Do they have to use it? Do they have a drug problem there?
Or
do they simply export it?
No, they do have a drug problem, but they don't have a fentanyl addiction problem.
Why not?
The drug choice is ketamine. Drug preferences. Methamphetamines is a huge drug problem.
But it used to be in the early when you see movies about the American drug problem in the early years, when the mafia was the key distributor of a lot of drugs, the drug pushers never used the product because they knew what the product did. Is that why China doesn't have a drug problem, because they know what the product does?
No, I don't
Okay.
think so. I think it's just the fact that we just have a handful of chemists and criminals that are trafficking this because of the profitability.
So what impact, if any, have you had in terms of working with China in reducing the amount of fentanyl coming out of that country?
Well, there's been a couple examples where we have had an impact. We've been trying to get them to control fentanyl, as we talked about. These fentanyl-type classes of drugs are being created, and you have to, from a regulatory perspective and a legal perspective, you have to actually control that in order for law enforcement to take action. And so they've actually controlled 175 of these substances, and that's through us negotiating and working with them and working with our DEA. But that's not enough, as I just mentioned, because it's being created once a week. And so we had a really big breakthrough at the G20 where the President Trump has got a commitment from President Xi Jinping to schedule the entire class, the entire group of fentanyl. So if it looks like a fentanyl, it would be controlled and it would be illegal to distribute. Now we're at the stage of getting them to put that into action, and so we're putting pressure to get them to fulfill their obligation.
But if I understand what you said in publications in the past, that even if the Chinese government wanted to cooperate to the full extent of their capabilities, it wouldn't be possible. They couldn't do it because they don't yet have a handle on the production of these synthetics in their own country.
It's nothing's a panacea, as you know,
Right.
when it comes to the drug problem. So this is a critical law enforcement tool that we're working on. Ultimately, the goal is to make it very difficult for traffickers to ship these drugs into the United States.
How does it get here? They're a long way away, China. There's a big ocean between us and them. So how does it get here?
Yeah, and this is the new phenomenon of the benefits of the 21st century. With the internet, dark web, somebody here in Charlotte can just go on their smartphone, look, 3 years ago, they can look at fentanyl online on the open source and order it right there, have it shipped through the mail, and come right to their doorsteps. And the sad thing is, they can skip the financial transaction of the banks by just paying with Bitcoin.
When these drugs are shipped into this country, are they big shipments, like we think of cocaine coming in hidden in trucks and things like that, or is it just in little sugar packets that are put in an envelope and mailed?
Yeah, and that's the difference because, as we just talked about, you only need a little bit for potency.
Right.
You can just ship a gram or a kilogram, and that's easily can fit in a package.
And that can't be detected?
It's hard to detect, but we're getting smarter and better, and this is where DHS is coming in. The State Department's also working with the Postal Union to get better tracking of these mails.
Is fentanyl the biggest drug problem that we have in this country, or is it cocaine or heroin or illegal marijuana or whatever it has been in the past?
I would say that it is. If you look at the
Fentanyl is the biggest
if you
drug
look
problem.
at the crises this country has had in the
And
past.
fentanyl is not being smuggled in across the Rio Grande.
Oh, it is. It is. It's coming from China. It's coming from Mexico.
It's also coming from Canada, isn't it?
A little bit, yes.
But it's coming. What's the ratio of how it gets here? Is it coming across our southern border? Is it coming from Canada? Is it coming through the United States Postal Service from China?
Yeah, it's a complicated answer because if you look at purity, if you look at the purity of the fentanyl, you measure it that way. Most of it's coming from China. If you look at it from volume, most of it's coming from Mexico, and the reason is because the Mexicans are mixing this fentanyl already, so it's already packaged as a pill or mixed with their heroin, and they're diluting it as well.
Is this Mexican fentanyl, is it Chinese fentanyl that the Mexicans have bought and had it shipped into Mexico, or is it being manufactured primarily?
We think the majority of it is being shipped from China. However, we are starting to see signs that they're producing it in Mexico.
And there's no way for the Chinese, since they want to be involved in this as a global leader, there's no way for them to know that there's a high amount of mail or FedEx packages or whoever they use leaving China for Mexico and or the United States, and that's a reason to suspect that maybe it's not widgets?
They're aware, but of course criminals are pretty clever, and they're starting to ship it to places like Tonga and then to the United States, and so they're taking multiple routes to get to the United States because law enforcement is starting to catch on to them and tracking this more. So unfortunately, as just like any type of criminal activity, the criminals are adapting. We have to adapt with them.
One of the other problems that I understand is the way we in the United States classify drugs versus how the Chinese classify drugs. Fentanyl is all fentanyl in the United States is classified in a certain way. Is that right? Doesn't matter what derivative.
That's correct at this point.
But in China, each drug has to be classified separately.
Yes.
So every mutation of fentanyl, every different chemical alteration is a different drug in their eye?
In their eye, that's correct. That's why getting them to schedule all this as a class is a big deal. And so when we got that commitment a few months ago in the G20, we have to get them to follow up. And so our pressure, we're continuing to place that pressure on them to follow up, execute it. They keep coming back, right, identifying that this is a lot of legal hurdles, but we keep pushing and pushing.
This is a multi-billion-dollar industry, isn't it?
Yeah, if you think about, you can buy a gram of fentanyl for $5,000 and produce it and turn that into $1 million, $1.5 million. It's a pretty profitable.
So for the manufacturers of this substance, which can be sold for $5,000 for a tiny amount and then exponentially expanded into $1 million of product. What's at stake for them? What's at stake for China? What's their motivation for wanting to cooperate if they're bringing so much money into the country?
Yeah, well, if you think about it, they're not producing a lot of money. These the legitimate chemical plants are not producing a lot of money. These are rogue chemists, oftentimes stealing the precursors, creating it in their basements. So what we have to do is actually, and this is part of our State Department strategy, is starting to integrate a public-private partnership, make them aware. So if our chemical industries are aware of who they're partnering with in China, and we start identifying these companies that have connections to these rogue chemists or illegitimate businesses, well, then they can have a part in helping us fight this off.
But on the one hand, they want to be a global leader. On the other hand, is it not in their best interest to hurt us? China.
I don't think that.
Okay.
I don't think we're at that.
What's the percentage of this drug that gets in through our southern border, and would a wall help?
Yeah, as again I mentioned, it's volume-wise, a vast majority of it does get in through the border.
And through ports of entry or through being smuggled across Where
Both,
there's no
but
fence.
the border is still a primary port of entry for this to be smuggled. It's smuggled in through Texas, Arizona, other places, and then it's driven by car.
Your organization, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, is encouraging China to crack down on traffickers. By that, do you mean people who are manufacturing, or do you mean people who are buying this and then operating these deep, dark websites where people can get it and then they ship it out to them?
Yeah, a little bit of both. And I'll give you a prime example. We actually worked with the UN because they had a little more influence, and they worked with Alibaba. And Alibaba committed to taking...
That's the Google of China.
That is correct. So this is a big deal for us. And they committed to taking the selling of fentanyl off their websites.
It was on their website?
It was on their websites.
And they knew it?
Yes, they did.
The state, it's a different world, isn't it?
It is.
The U.S. State Department is working with both the Canadian and the Mexican governments on this drug trafficking problems in general, specifically on this too. And you've provided inspection equipment and more than 500 detection dogs to Mexican agencies. You're building Mexico's capacity to eradicate opium poppy crops and other illicit drug production, and to bring manufacturers and traffickers to justice. How do the barbed comments of our president with regard to Mexicans and those who come across our border impact your ability to have productive conversations with these folks?
We're still having productive conversations, and it's primarily because that we've been partnering with a lot of these institutions for several years. The Merit Initiative, which is an initiative that started under President Bush, we provided $1.5 billion to address some of these issues. And so you think about it, all the partnerships, working with these institutions, that has lasting power. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you a prime example of where it's having an impact. Methamphetamines is another primary scourge of drugs that we're facing coming out of Mexico. Working with the Mexican Navy, actually, they successfully seized 117 metric tons of methamphetamines last year. That is enough to give every man, woman, and child in America 12 doses of methamphetamines. And so I tell you that the partnership that we have in Mexico is still critical. Working with them is still valuable because that's just one prime example of where we just said.
Well, I was going to ask you, given the complexity of the web of suppliers from China into Mexico and even here at home and the ever-evolving forms of fentanyl, is this a losing battle or one you think you can win? But it sounds like you are having an impact.
Yeah, we're having an impact, but if you look at overall drug policy, we can't do it alone, and that's why you look at our overall national strategy. We've got a lot of hard lessons learned, and supply reduction is just a piece of it. And I recognize that I am just a piece of our overall strategy. That's why we work on drug demand reduction programs overseas.
James Walsh is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.